conversation. Access to justice for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. That's a conversation we are going to be having right here on NTV Uganda. Yes, in 2020 alone, according to the Uganda Police Crime Report, 6,000 cases were actually registered. Now, out of those, yes, we do know that there were almost, there were 8,000 cases that were registered in 2020, and out of those, we did have 6,000 cases that did amount to defilement in that regard. So how many of those cases went all the way to the courtroom to ensure that the perpetrators are actually arrested in that regard? Justice has been, you know, a dream for many of these victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and that's why we are here to talk about this issue and a lot more. I'm joined by Phoebe Murungi. She is the Director of Legal Services at Barefoot Law. Later on, we shall be joined by Susan Echen. She is the Program Lead of, you know, Women's Rights and Access to Justice at Uganda Women's Network. Thank you for joining us. A very good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. When you say access to justice, what exactly do we mean?
So justice is a broad concept, but essentially what it means is any access to remedy.
Indeed.
So, and that may include formal justice systems as well as informal justice systems. And just to briefly mention what those are is the formal justice system includes court, which is what people are most familiar with. Court, lawyers, judges, police, that is what the formal justice system looks like. But there is a wider justice system, and that involves the informal. The informal sector will involve family, friends, elders, clan leads, local council leaders and such.
Indeed. And of course, the informal settings that were largely, you know, transpiring during the COVID-19 pandemic. Those local tribunals setting up their local laws and, you know, dispensing justice in that regard. And oftentimes, we got to understand that the women were being discriminated against by the informal justice system. But how so?
Yeah. So the difficulty with the informal justice system is that unlike the formal justice system, which has mechanisms that are put in place to reduce discrimination, to reduce forms of bias, and you're supposed to follow the law when you're dealing with a formal justice system. When you're dealing with an informal one, bias can creep in a lot easier. So if you're dealing, for instance, in a clan where one of the practices that they believe in and they've promulgated, if some of the belief systems are discriminatory against women, it is going to be very difficult for you to enforce a system that is fair to both people that are being heard. So there is some bias that can creep in, but that bias can be there even in formal justice systems. So the idea is to basically challenge social norms that are discriminatory at all levels.
Social norms, including this informal justice system, aren't they some of the factors that have actually contributed or exacerbated the culture of silence among the victims?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to come out as a survivor of gender-based violence, sexual or otherwise, and that is even made more difficult with systems, for instance, of shaming of victims and survivors. There are systems in which actually the people that you trust and you have entrusted with the information are themselves going to stop you from going to the systems of formal or informal justice mechanisms. You also have, aside from shaming, there is ridicule, there is stigma, there is just the social, a social arrangement that just makes it far more difficult for a victim or a survivor of gender-based violence to report something as opposed to someone who's been stolen from. So those are all part of the things that make it far more difficult to deal with.
It seems like instead of dispensing justice to this victim, the system is doing the opposite. It is actually vilifying the victims of sexual and gender-based violence.
Well, I wouldn't say that generally, because in every system there is bias. So even in more developed systems, even in the formal justice sector, you have bias issues coming up and social norms that dictate how people respond to these issues.
Even so social norms in a formal setting?
I mean, humans are humans.
I see.
That's the issue. So even when you were trained to reduce bias, to watch out, to be aware of your bias, it's still very difficult. If your experience as being a member of one gender is only one, you may not fully understand what the other gender goes through. So for instance, your interpretation of someone not speaking up until a year later may be different, while a person of the gender that has suffered such harm would easily understand why it would take as long as a year to report a case.
Let's talk about some of those stumbling blocks that have made it so hard for the women to actually access justice in this regard. What are some of those stumbling blocks?
There's so many, but some of them apply to both genders. Some of them are specifically troubling for women. women and girls. But some of these include just few courts and few court officials. That will impact the formal justice sector. A limitation of resources, so you'll find under-resourced police posts, under-resourced courts, under-resourced systems that are supposed to provide assistance, very few legal aid centers. That's in the formal justice sector. Few lawyers also. Primarily, the number of lawyers is about, I think, over 80% in Kampala.
I can see why you're also stepping in to fill the void.
Absolutely. There's such a huge void, because if you live in rural parts, that's one factor. If you are a woman, that's another inhibiting factor. If you are physically disabled, that's another factor. If you are less educated, that's a factor. So for some people, they have 1 or even up to 10 of these factors that make it far more difficult for them to access justice. But the biggest one, the one that we tackle at Barefoot Law, is the failure to access information. So there are some people who want to challenge these abuses, but they don't know where to start. They don't know where to go.
They do not have any information. Information to do with, maybe, let's say, for example, when you go to a police station and you are a victim of defilement, you're not supposed to call for any money. All the tests and investigations are supposed to be, you know, coughed by the police officers or the police system, the judicial system itself. But then, one too many times, victims are being told, we need money for this swab, we need money to investigate this, we need this medical report, you need to come up with some kind of money. Is this the kind of information we are talking about?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talk about is the hindrances that you may meet, even if those may include corruption or other things. But the hindrances, the lack of access to information also includes where should I go? So you will have a variety of places that you can go to report a crime. But of course, you're beginning with the police.
I see.
But after you're done with the police, there is other issues that come up. So survivors need medical attention. Survivors need sometimes emergency shelters. Sometimes they need psychosocial support. So the issue of gender-based violence is not just a legal one. And I think most people are very afraid when they think that everything that comes after experiencing a gender-based violence of any kind is going to enter a formal justice system, but it doesn't. Sometimes what you need is medical, psychosocial, community support, and after which you can make a decision on whether you want to take on a legal form of justice, under which you may still have a variety of options available to you.
Let's also talk about the issue of corruption that has really largely transpired among the judicial system, also among the coffers of the police. When a victim presents a case at a police station, police officers collude with the perpetrator and later, they let them go scot-free. Let's talk about that, the corruption within the judicial and the police system.
Yeah, indeed, as a country, we're struggling with corruption in all sectors, and the judicial sector isn't the only one. And there are lots of mechanisms that have been introduced even within the system to weed out those instances. So for many cases where your problem is at the prosecutorial level, where you have made a report, but for some reason the file is missing, or someone's missing, or the evidence has been tampered with, or things like that. There are mechanisms within the Director of Public Prosecutions where you can report to the officer in charge. The officer in charge can be summoned, or that file can be summoned to the DPP's office and switched if that is necessary. Further evidence can be extracted if that is necessary. There is also mechanisms within there to also dispense justice against those that have been proved to interfere with the system. So I think you've seen sometimes traffic officers also being paraded not paraded, but under their own tribunals. Sometimes they're also brought to justice for interfering with systems. Obstruction of justice is a crime, so you can be prosecuted for that. And in the judicial system as well, there's the appeals. You can appeal if a decision has not gone the way that you believe it should. It can be based on bias, it can be based on interference, on obstruction, whatever the reason. And aside from appeals, there is also just complaints that can be made against either a lawyer or a judge that you believe has obstructed the justice that you deserve.
Even the judicial system, when these victims are presented before a judge, this is what the judge is asking of them nowadays. The judge is saying, oh, you were defiled. Please present your genital parts and let us see for proof, indeed, if you are indeed defiled in that case. Now, such acts being called for by the judicial system, aren't they going to actually push away more victims who would have wanted to come out and testify in the courts of law. How do you even tell a victim to present their genital parts in public?
Well, just to correct that slightly, the presentation of the physical evidence is done at the police stage, and there is a medical examiner who takes that evidence, and that evidence is produced not physically in court, but it is produced as a medical report. So the report is what then is brought to court, but it doesn't take away the fact that there is sometimes re-traumatization, even at the medical officers.
I see.
Sometimes a girl will report a defilement and will be kept at a medical officer's station for hours because they do not have the kits, sometimes at police, sometimes they themselves are detained because they're waiting to receive the kits that will conduct these tests. So there are many forms of re-traumatization that are happening, aside from also the institutional violence that is perpetrated by delays, incredible delays, procedural delays, also biases by the people that are supposed to support you along the way will contribute to that re-traumatization. Sometimes you report a case to the police and the police themselves are trivializing the case, and so there's many ways in which you could be traumatized by the system, but that is part of the social norms that we need to challenge as individuals, as a society, and also through formal systems by reporting incidents.
We also do know that in 2020, as per the police crime report, GBV cases amounted to 8,000. You also did have defilements amounted to 6,000, rape around 700. You also did have 223 cases of aggravated assault and also 144 cases of indecent assault. So in the wake of all these laws that we have surrounding sexual violence, why do we see a persistent rise of these cases in this country?
So I think I could say like all other crimes, the promulgation of laws that are meant to combat them is step one. But the crimes are committed by humans, and those humans are committing crimes because they have a certain understanding of a social context. That may mean, for instance, in Uganda, there is a highly patriarchal system. There is a system that oppresses women more than the other sex or the other gender. So when you have issues like that, the offenses are going to continue to happen because people still have beliefs that mean they treat women as second-grade citizens. They will treat girls as property. That's why we still have instances of child marriages, instances of children being sold into sexual trafficking. So those are based on understandings, and social change is much harder to work on than, for instance, the work that we do, which is legal. The social change is the one that can ensure that instances of gender-based violence are reduced, advocacy, men protecting girls and women in their communities, as individuals. Of course, I'm not saying it actually only happens to women, so obviously men can be victims as well, and that happens. But basically the understanding is that there has to be social change as well as using the law to remedy cases that have taken place.
When legal experts say Uganda has gender-blind policies and laws, in this respect, what do they mean exactly, Phoebe?
So, okay.
Gender-blind laws and policies.
I'll give an example. If the law requires you to corroborate evidence, that just means an incident has occurred, there is a report, the victim has made a statement, but there are instances in which there is a need for corroborative evidence. Not always. If a law like that existed, it would look on the surface as if it is a fair law. What happens is that in instances where you have, for instance, a rape, and there were only 2 people present, and there is no physical evidence left to obtain, it is going to mean that the victim of the rape is going to have a harder time proving an offense like that than, for instance, a break-in where you'd have a broken window, traces of footprints, things like that. There are many instances in which a law, which on the surface looks non-discriminatory, is going to discriminate against a particular gender simply because the way that it applies to that gender is different. So the gender blindness does not always mean that the law is negative. It just means that it hasn't taken into account the special needs of certain groups.
All right. So we're talking about the challenges dampening the resolve of survivors and victims from accessing the justice that they actually clamor for. That is Phoebe Murungi, the Director of Legal Services at Barefoot Law. We are now joined by Susanna Chen. She is a lawyer and she's the current program lead of women's rights and access to justice at the Uganda Women's Network, and she also joins us at this opportune moment to make sense of the increasing cases of sexual gender-based violence and also violence against women and girls, also intimate partner violence, and also violence against children. Very good afternoon, Susan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And indeed, my first question, the pandemic-driven spike in sexual gender-based violence. We'd like to know, what should the communities that are listening or watching this show right now know about the increasing cases of sexual gender-based violence, especially the survivors?
Just like Phoebe has said, these crimes are committed by human beings.
Indeed.
And these are human beings that live amongst us. Statistics from the police crime reports also show that the perpetrators of sexual gender-based violence tend to be very close to the survivor.
Indeed.
They tend to be fathers, they tend to be grandparents, they tend to be brothers. They are that close. But also, the spike during the pandemic was because survivors were locked down in very close proximity with their perpetrators. We were locked down in homes. Support for redress was difficult to find. Stakeholders, duty bearers who have a duty to protect, to provide, these response services, also could not move in some cases.
Okay.
So the mere fact that they were basically locked down together made it difficult, one, for them to get out of that situation, to report, to seek support elsewhere because of the restrictions on travel, on communication, and on the workings of the different actors in the GBV and the justice pathway. Communities need to know that the responsibility to say, to condemn violence and not to be the bystander with their mobile phone videoing and a violation, it starts with them. At which point do we say no?
Blow the whistle.
Yes. At which point do you blow the whistle? At which point do we as communities say, we are not going to tolerate this kind of behavior? But one of the things that we commonly see in the work that we do is that perpetrators will be protected by the communities. They'll give all sorts of excuses. No, he's an impotent man. He cannot defile. He cannot rape. He's a rich man. He has been helping everybody. You people, you're trying to bring him down politically. The excuses are always there. And it starts with us, the community. Even where the state has put in place legislation, it has put in place processes, there are institutions that can actually do a good job in curbing violence. Communities are the start and end of it. Because if we condemn, if we connive to protect, if we disappear evidence, then there is no way that a survivor can actually get redress. Cases will die a natural death, and at the end of the day, the justice systems get, they get blamed. Yeah. So
let's talk about the current legal regime. What is it like for us right now? Susan Chen.
Yeah. Uganda has a robust legal regime. In the last 10 to 11 years, we've enacted several legislation. We have an act against female genital mutilation. We have an act against human trafficking. We have an act that prohibits torture. We have the HIV/AIDS Control and Prevention Act, which also protects violence against persons living with HIV. But to cap it all, we have the Domestic Violence Act.
And the Penal Code?
We also have the Penal Code. Yes, now, in as much as we have all these laws, there's also the question of enforcement. There's a question of implementation. And that has a huge effect on the efficacy of these laws. There's the question of resourcing for institutions directly mandated to implement and enforce to actually deliver on their mandate. But there's also the question of capacity of these institutions to understand the laws, and for our case in particular, to be gender responsive, to know that I need to apply them, taking into account the needs of the different either litigants. Especially if it is a woman, how do I handle the case? If it is a child, it's a different story. The way I would handle a 70-year-old man will be very different from the way I'll handle the case of a 30-year-old gentleman.
Indeed.
You see? So there are all those dynamics that come into play. We should not also forget the social factors which affect how people perceive justice, especially for women. Where do you report? Should you even report? Should you pursue the case? Do you have the means? You know, you are living in this family where you have married. The resources at your disposal are mostly as a user. If you go ahead to pursue a case, what happens to you? So in as much as we have all these laws, there are a number of hurdles in the middle there that make them difficult, you know, to achieve the protection that they are meant to.
You also did mention that, you know, communities are normalizing this whole trend. When perpetrator X is arrested, they'll say, no, this is politically motivated, they just want to bring this gentleman down. And one too many times, the attention is focused on the lady now. Yeah. What was she wearing on the night she was defiled? Yeah. Where was she going in the wee hours? Such questions, don't you think they go a long way in vilifying the victims? And it takes us away from the main conversation, which is putting this guy or gentleman to account for his actions.
Yes, it absolutely does. And those are some of the social, cultural dynamics that affect access to justice. But going back to what you've said, the normalization of acceptance of a rising level of tolerance towards violence, especially against women, is something that we need to pay keen attention to. It is normalized because it is somehow embedded in our social construction. It is embedded in our socialization. For example, for men incidentally are also survivors. They face violence. But it is difficult for a man to walk into the first police station and say he is a survivor, he is going through this situation, because it may be perceived as a sign of weakness rather than as a sign of vulnerability for which he needs support. So it's really around our socialization, but the beauty about socialization is that it's dynamic.
Indeed.
It's not static. And with the right legal means, justice means, education, advocacy, and really a firm hand on you know, to address violence, there are certain things that can change. There are narratives that can change.
Indeed.
Yeah. And
in that regard, Susan Chen, I wanted us to talk about the informal justice system, the customary informal justice system. One too many times, when a woman is violated, the chiefs will sit down, the community leaders will sit down and they'll ask, did the gentleman pay bride price? Yes, indeed, he paid bride price. So this is totally a family issue. Please go back and settle this back at home. So do you think the issue of bride price has added more, you know, fuel to this problem that we are dealing with right now? Socio-constructs like bride price.
Yes, bride price is a custom, it's a practice that we value. It makes us who we are. We identify through it. And how it, of itself, it's not a bad thing, but it is how we use it, how we perceive it, that makes it a tool for violence. If used in the wrong way, it itemizes.
Against the women.
Yes, it itemizes, it objectifies, it commodifies a human being.
Indeed.
And you find that a woman, a wife, loses any negotiating power that she has.
I hear you. Because
it will always be said, but we took bride price. You are our wife. That's a very common statement people make. You are our wife, we married you. So it makes it difficult many a time for women to ably access justice. Cultural institutions, religious institutions are, according to statistics, this year we completed a research on to study factors hindering access to justice for women and girls.
Indeed.
And one of the findings was that 43% of women and children will start with cultural and religious leaders first. Then they'll go, 23% will report their case to the LC, and then 26% will go to the courts. Only 7%, surprisingly, will go to their family members. What does that say?
Indeed.
It points to a lack of confidence in that basic unit of society to solve a justice need. Cultural and religious institutions provide a very good opportunity because they are in close proximity with the survivor. They are generally affordable. You do not have to hire the services of a lawyer. You do not have to travel so far. The costs are generally significantly limited.
Indeed.
One of the challenges that they face is that some of their methods tend to clash with formal law. Cultural institutions, the customary informal justice system is a structure within the justice system, and it actually works. But the challenges that they face with finding complementarity with the formal legal system is what sometimes makes it an unwise option for a litigant. Because again, it is based on patriarchy, it is based on religion, and those are strong beliefs which which always put women second place. So for many women, it might provide a solution, a quick one, but the question remains whether it is substantive justice. Are they just going through the motions, or are they finding a right, the fair solution to this problem? Yeah.
All right, that is Susan Chen. Phoebe Murungi would like to know how the customary or informal justice systems fit into the overall justice system.
Well, Susan has mentioned a little bit on that, actually for the most part. But one of the ways that has sprung up, especially around the time of the pandemic, was that there are mediations that can happen at customary level, at clan level, at family level, or it's simply at a level where the perpetrator has met with a victim or representatives of either side. And once there's mediation that has occurred and a resolution has been agreed to by parties, that mediation settlement can be presented to a court if there was a case before, or if you want to institute a case at that point, you can then get that mediation recorded as a consent judgment. And that's one of the things that would actually improve the quality.
If the informal justice system is exacerbating these biases, gender biases that we are seeing, shouldn't we do away with it if the local leaders at some point are going to say, female X, you did receive bride price from male Y, so please go back to the confines of your home and actually settle this issue, because it's a personal issue. And according to them, if that person paid bride price.
I think the difficulty is understanding our context. We are a population of about 40 million. We do not have a system that can contribute to each and every victim, every survivor, every perpetrator to get a court in all these areas. We're still advocating for more courts, more lawyers, more judges. Like I said earlier, almost 80, I think probably more than 80% of the lawyers are all within Kampala. That just means that representation is going to be difficult outside of that area. We still need other forms of justice systems, and they have a particular importance also because they are able to conduct a form of justice that includes restitution and restoration. So you can have systems that include apologies where you're dealing with small concerns. If it's a larger concern, you can even get to the point of receiving compensation, which is something that sometimes is not done in the formal justice system as well. You could have systems that actually bring back a perpetrator into the system, is rehabilitated and understands what they did wrong, apologizes, and is taken back into the community as a member of the community. So there are very many pros that come from informal justice mechanisms. There is also the lack of intimidation. Some people are just more comfortable in a room which is filled with people they know. While when you enter a courtroom, the intimidation levels are quite something. Everyone is suited, there's gowns, there's language you don't understand, sometimes you don't speak English. So there are many issues that mean that we need to still have both systems. What we need to do is make sure that both of them, we help advocate for more resources, a reduction of the bias, training to help the people that legislate, the people that conduct these justice systems to do it better.
Phoebe Murungi, we've also learned as NMG, based on some of the research we've been expediting, that it's more of the women in the rural areas who are prone to this sexual gender-based violence than their counterparts within the urban areas. What are some of those factors making it very, very hard for the women in the rural areas?
Well, as my colleague mentioned, there is the issue of commoditization. In the more rural the area, the less control women have.
I see.
Often because there is simply there's an added value mentally that people place on a woman that has more resources. So if you have more resources, even in a rural area, you're going to be on a different hierarchy. There's this hierarchization of society that happens everywhere. So which means that even when you're an urban dwelling woman, if you have less money, you are lower valued. Then if you have more money, if you have more education, so the system is it's so skewed in that sense, but what it means is that in the rural area, you're more likely not to have access to information. You're more likely not to have access to a phone to even tell anyone what has happened to you. You're less likely to have access to a lawyer. You're less likely to speak English. You're less likely to be educated. You're less likely to have people around you that will so there are so many factors that come just with being less connected that mean that you may face a higher form of violence or more exposure to violence, and all these factors just work together.
And of course, Susan Chen, the fact that we are talking about 500,000 young girls being impregnated from March of 2020 up to now, and the fact that we are talking about 17,000 child marriages since then, it means the law has not done its work. Because if we are talking about 500,000 getting pregnant, we should be talking about 500,000 men somewhere being jailed. But that is not the case. What is being done to actually ensure that we reach out to these young girls and they get some kind of justice, courtesy of the Uganda Women's Network?
One of the things that we do as Uganda Women's Network is really to rally allies, rally advocates around causes such as addressing the pandemic right now, that is teenage pregnancy.
Indeed.
It has reached pandemic levels.
500,000, yes.
Yes. So one of the things that we have done with our partners across the country is amplify the issues around teenage pregnancy, amplify the issues around sexual gender-based violence, amplify the issues around violence against children, against girls in this case. It is very important to note that the Ministry of Education and Sports has a policy on the reintegration of pregnant girls into school. That is very important. It's an important move that as a country, as a community, we need to flip our minds to appreciate.
The first step of justice, if you will.
Yes. How are we supporting these girls to go back, you know, to resume the life of a child, really, and fit into the context of a child mother.
Indeed.
Yes. So that policy is a good step. The issues around it now become our institutions, are the secondary schools and the primary schools ready for that? Because also for them, they have attitude issues towards these, towards such policies. Yeah. If our schools are not capacitated to reintegrate these girls into school, to provide a safe space for them to come back into school, for them to learn, for them to even be able to address the issues of child care. Because, I mean, they are mothers. What happens if a 4-month-old, a 5-month-old suddenly needs, you know, their mother's direct attention? How are our schools ready for that? But also the communities, are we ready to embrace that policy? The question of the apprehension, could I use that term, of the perpetrators on the other side, the 500 million men who might have been, you know, who are part of this, also is a huge challenge. And that is something which as a country we still grapple with. The 500 cases you're mentioning are the reported cases. Indeed. Yeah, they're the reported cases. So what happens to the unreported, the untold stories that we do not hear about? It's an uphill task for the country, and it's something that requires a multi-sectoral approach to be able to address, because we are facing a time bomb. In the next few years, there's going to be an explosion of population, but also of the quality of life of a certain generation, which may not have, one, gone back to school, is not able to provide, you know, a quality of life for certain members of their family. So this is something which as a country we really need to take seriously.
And of course it is a dire situation whereby children are giving birth to other children. How will these children be able to take care of themselves and the other children that they are giving birth to?
Yeah.
Susanna Chan is a lawyer. We also do have another lawyer in our midst, that is Phoebe Murungi. Phoebe, let's talk about innovations and best practices for access to justice for these victims that emerged during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
Acquaint me.
Okay, so there are innovations that have come up from the supply end,
Right.
that is the legal service providers, and there's innovations that have come from the justice sector as well. And in this period, as Susan was mentioning, a lot of service providers were locked down. Courts were locked down. There were too many people that were unable to reach the places that they needed to reach in order to provide justice. So some of the innovations that came up, at least out of the justice sector, is we saw live virtual sessions of court that were taking place, people taking plea online. To this day, I think there's still some that are being conducted, some judgments that are being delivered online.
Indeed.
So those are innovations in the justice sector that could not have worked pre-COVID, because we did not even contemplate a time when we would be doing such things. So that definitely was something that helped.
Meaning if it weren't for this pandemic, it would be business as usual. Victims being unable to trek from point A to X to receive some kind of justice.
Very likely, very likely. It's also a problem from prisons, because the prison people getting to the courtroom and getting an adjournment just means you've lost a lot of resources in that process. While you can still conduct a process like that with a TV from the police, from the prison, and one connected to the judge that's taking over. So other things that came from the supply end were call centers. That was of high importance in that season. So a lot of these toll-free lines were ringing 24/7, and the capacity was very low. And that's one of the things that we've recognized as Barefoot Law as something that we need to put more resources into, because we have a whole spectrum of digitalization. We have people that are on the lower end who can only access a phone where they can get USSD codes and receive SMSs and respond. So you're catering to that person. Those are the people who will maybe have access to a local language newspaper, a radio or TV if they get to that point. But across the spectrum, you'll have people that have access to social media, people that have access to the internet and all the provisions there on websites, YouTube, etc., all the way to the end, to the people that can attend webinars. So for us, one of the innovations was really making the best use out of these tools and having information on all those platforms. So you'd find FAQs about social, family justice issues, domestic violence issues on the website, but you could also get an SMS if you do not have access to the internet. You can call a toll-free line, and that would help you speak with a lawyer. And so there are all these innovations which, to be honest, existed, but they were sprung up and they were re-energized by the fact that people were failing to access the traditional methods of justice. And that also is a reminder to us that there are people who have been in that position from before COVID, from before the pandemic. So it is our responsibility to just make sure that across the spectrum, there is always a way within which you can reach
Of course, justice. You did talk about the internet as one avenue through which victims could be able to access justice. But then it was also another avenue through which some people were actually being violated. Sexual, gender-based violence actually took center stage online, on the internet. But how rife was it during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, aside from just what the statistics would show, I think it's obvious that with the advent and the increase of social media usage and the internet, it's just a transfer of platforms. So what people were doing on the streets, heckling, touching people, inappropriate comments, that has just been moved to another platform. And just like you know, in the US, how we're seeing now, some people think, oh, it's only now that black people are being treated in a certain way by the police, but really it's that it was happening, but now we have technology that's helping us to see it. So equally here, cyber harassment is just something that is moving to a new platform. So it's the same gender issues, it's the same social norms that we are dealing with, and the same tools to combat it are still available to us, but not being used as much. The advocacy, the stepping in to support survivors, the provision of, on that same internet where I have been abused, I need to find a hotline where I can report this. I need to be able to produce evidence to a court that they can accept. So that's where you get e-services from the court. Can they accept a WhatsApp message as evidence, which are things that actually the judiciary has implemented and are available, which is a big step. And I know the justice, law and order sector is working on guidelines, I think legislation or guidelines that are going to make this easier, so you can track your case online and on your phone and whatever. So there's so many opportunities, but there's also dangers, and that's just how it works.
Indeed, but help my viewer understand that violence could take so many forms, if you will. You have a viewer who is saying, to me, violence is when I slap someone and they feel that pain. But then help them understand that even verbal communication, if not done the right way, it can translate into violence in that regard, and the law could catch up with it.
Yeah, indeed, the Domestic Violence Act that Susan mentioned covers all these different forms. So there is what you spoke of, which is covered by the Computer Misuse Act, which is using the cyberspaces to perpetrate violence. So language that you're using in there is part of that. But equally, you will have economic violence, which is perpetrated often by one gender or the perpetrator having an economic hold over their victim, and they're using that to perpetrate violence such that you cannot even live as a victim who is continuously being victimized because their position means they are unable to take care of themselves or their loved ones. You will have verbal violence, which you mentioned, which for many people there's a lot of trivialization of forms of violence that aren't physical, but the reminder is really that you can trust yourself to know what violence is. If you are feeling attacked, threatened, assaulted in any manner, it may not even be covered under domestic violence, but there is an offense. There is assault, there is indecent assault, there is all forms of violence that are perpetrated and covered under different laws. So the beauty, as Susan mentions, is that the legal regime is really robust, and it does cover all forms, from torture to verbal assault. All those things are provided for, and it is our duty to, first of all, provide that information, which is one of the issues that we find at Barefoot Law, is that the failure to access legal information is the first problem that people have. If you don't know that what has been done to you is an offense and you can receive retribution, then there is nowhere to begin. So the first place is to provide a system that can allow people to access information. There's been innovations like ULI, for instance, where you can go online and see all the recorded cases or precedents on the issue, find all the legislation that's available. Amazing. What we do on our sites is to break that down into the most basic language so anyone can understand it. So it's really trying to find every channel to make sure that the person that is could be a victim or survivor is able to find redress.
Indeed, sexual gender-based violence can actually chase you all the way from the confines of the jurisdiction of Luero all the way to the dark corners of the internet. That's what we are saying right now. As you use the internet to actually look for some kind of redress, you should also be cognizant of the fact that there are perpetrators waiting to pounce on you. There are perpetrators on the internet grooming your children right now. And it is happening. In my midst, I do have Phoebe Murungi. She is the Director of Legal Services at Barefoot Law. We also do have Susan Chen. She is the current program lead of women's rights, and that is access to justice for those victims at Uganda Women's Network. Susan Chen, let's talk about legal reform and also enforcement of the law. How are the social norms that we are talking about right now affecting the transformation or legal reform agenda and the enforcement of the law, especially in the line of women and girls?
Social norms play a huge role in our appreciation of a bill, of a proposal for a law. Many of the social norms around the laws that are being enacted make communities reflect on their customs, on their practices, on their values, on their way of life. And that is how they approach appreciation. That's how they decide whether it's acceptable to them or not. If there is a perception that a proposal, a bill, is empowering one gender or the other, then there will be a problem. If there is a perception that it is watering down an entrenched and valued custom or practice, then there is a problem. I will give an example of the Marriage and Divorce Bill 2009, which has been on the floor of Parliament for the last so many years.
Indeed.
In 2013, when that debate was had, one of the hugest objections to it was that women were trying to take over the property of men. How do you come, you marry me, and then you want to take over what is not yours? So there was this whole gender divide. It was them against us. And that is how we approach the formulation of law. Does it affect my power base? that is how people look at it. I have had opportunities to sit with legislators and discuss, you know, break down some of the clauses in many of these bills. And it is not uncommon to hear from a member of parliament that I cannot support that. My people will not vote for me.
Indeed.
So there's also that attitude.
Fear of reprisal.
There's fear of reprisal, but there's also fear that it is going to affect a political future.
These are the populists.
Yes, it's going to affect my political future.
They take the side of the majority even though they are wrong.
Exactly. So people also look inwardly. They forget that law is meant to be, it's meant to benefit a whole community. It is meant to persist for years, you know. So those are the social challenges that we have, which actually now affect how our laws are made. Yeah.
Of course, and the Uganda Women's Network is not sitting idly. You're joining hands with the 16 Days of Activism, an initiative that kickstarted on November 25th, stretching all the way to December 10th. What are you adding onto this initiative to ensure that justice for the victims is actually ensured?
16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is a campaign that everybody should be interested in.
Indeed.
Yes, and for us as Uganda Women's Network, we are interested in many aspects, but we are also interested in access to justice, because it is one of the tools that is going to prevent and respond to violence against women. If one can have legal information, access to a lawyer, or access to a settlement, a process of settlement that provides a fair and just solution to their problem that is related to violence, then that is how we are contributing to this campaign. So right now we are running a number of campaigns on Twitter, via social media. We are running a number of campaigns on TV and on radio, but we're also having different engagements with different actors in the justice pathway, with religious and cultural leaders, with judicial officers, and also with allies like Barefoot Law. And we also are part of a bigger body called the Domestic Violence Act Coalition.
I see.
Which is a body of different actors, organizations, individuals at the national and district level. We also have some government, could I call them, members in that coalition, and we are all, you know, moving in that direction.
And right now you also have the Nation Media Group offering itself and its services to disseminate this information as it comes through. We shall keep on, you know, noticing whatever is happening in the coffers so that we bring you this information in a verified manner. We're talking about 16 Days of Activism and Violence Now Against Women. Now, Phoebe Morungi is here. Let's talk about the recommendations. Let's talk about recommendations coming in from Barefoot Law to actually increase access for these justice victims.
Yeah. So as Barefoot Law, our understanding and our belief is that you cannot access a justice system that you have no information about. So our work is to provide that first platform where you understand what has happened to me. Does it consist of a crime? Do I get civil or criminal remedy? Where do I go? Because there are so many actors, so many places to go, and there's a complex system. It's a complex system that is difficult for many people to traverse. So what we do is supply all the information on all the channels possible. So we use traditional and non-traditional sources of media. We use, for the traditional ones, you have newspapers, you have radio, you have SMSs, you have toll-free lines. On the side of the more connected, we have social media, we have YouTube, we have webinars that we conduct on these issues, down all the way to virtual meetings and virtual calls. So those are all ways in which we try to remedy this situation by at least providing you with the first block.
I see.
Then from there, one of the things that Susan has mentioned, which is very important, is there's got to be a holistic approach. All the actors have to come together in order to solve this, because gender-based violence, unlike other forms of violence, consists of things which will need medical redress, it will need psychosocial support,
Indeed.
you will need legal remedy,
Indeed.
you will need community support. So all those things are provided by different actors. The one way to respond is to have a holistic approach, something that can address all the different layers. So the victim at the end feels heard, a survivor feels like they have received the attention they deserve, restitution and restoration, whatever that means to them.
Indeed.
So, and a couple of the other recommendations is just using technology. That's one of the things that came out of the pandemic that we think, I mean, it's key to our work, but what it showed is that that is something that anyone can adopt. At that point, people were buying Zoom off it was flying off the shelves.
Do you know what the French are doing, Phoebe? They have put in place a mechanism that would allow a victim not to go to a police station, but to go to a safe space somewhere and call the police.
Yeah.
Absolutely. See,
Because one too many times when the victim is seen going to a police station, the perpetrators actually beat them to it. They
Yeah.
go pay the police officers, and that case is now gone.
On
But
top of
then,
the
if you
stigma.
are to report with this safe space, can it work in Uganda here?
Oh, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
part of the things that are
Indeed.
the witness protection
Technology.
bill,
Witness protection
something that's
bill,
been in
yeah.
the works for a long time. But obviously, digitalization is one of the methods to actually improve anonymity.
All right.
Because if I can report without being known, no
That's the
stigma.
best way to go. Thank you very much. And Susanna Chen, a minute, your recommendation before we go.
I couldn't re-echo more what Phoebe has said.
Indeed.
So mine would be to add that we really should try to find a mechanism for increasing intersectionality between the cultural, between the informal justice sector
Indeed.
and the formal justice sector.
Indeed.
Because as Phoebe mentioned before, there are very many benefits of having an informal justice sector that is able to provide justice, substantive justice. So how can we capacitate that sector to work in a manner that provides justice and that does not get into conflict with the law? Because they are right there with the people. My final appeal would really be for us as individuals. Every one of us has an influence, a circle of influence, and it's really about how we make our decisions, how we use our power. If we use it wrongly, then we are perpetrators. We have the ability to become a perpetrator of violence.
And with that, we've come to the end of this conversation. My name is Romeo Busika. Of course, I've been talking to Susanna Chen. She is the current program lead of Women's Rights and Access to Justice at the Uganda Women's Network, or UWONET. She was not alone. We also did have Phoebe Murungi. She is the Director of Legal Services at Barefoot Law. Many thanks for having made the time to speak to us on this very, very pertinent conversation. Indeed. Increasing access to victims of sexual gender-based violence in that regard. And TV at 1 is going to be taking center stage shortly after these messages. Keep around.